I live in New York City, which is not only a cultural capital, but it's also one of the leading centers of demographic change in the United States. Demographers have projected that in the US, people of color in aggregate, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans, will eclipse the historic majority Caucasian population by 2042. And this flip will occur much earlier for the nation's children under 18. It'll happen in 2023. And it's already happened in major urban centers like New York or entire states like California. And at the same time, our nation is growing more divided along racial and economic lines. Nicholas Kristof recently wrote in the New York Times about the shooting death of Michael Brown, a young African-American man in Ferguson, Missouri. He made the startling comparison that in the US in the last decade, it now has a greater wealth gap by race than South Africa under apartheid. So what does this wealth gap mean in terms of activating public space? In Manhattan, a 33-story building is being constructed that will have luxury condominiums that will cost up to $25 million each. And these condominiums will have luxury amenities like concierge services, entertainment rooms, etc. But it will also have units for people making $50,000 a year or less. However, those residents won't have access to the same amenities, and they will have to enter through a separate entrance. I worked with the great writer James Baldwin. In fact, I was the last theater director to work with him. I directed his play Blues for Mr. Charlie, which was based on the murder of Emmett Till and set in the Deep South during segregation. Baldwin didn't want that civil rights era play to be seen as a piece of sealed history. And so I activated the public space by using the social conventions of the Jim Crow era. I segregated the audience under two different doors, and they faced each other during the performance. It was shockingly powerful, but it was also theater. Now, a half-century after the legislated end of segregation in America, for-profit developers have brought back separate entrances to unequal facilities. Now, I started with that context to really question the larger framework of inequality that defines and divides public in the same city, and sometimes on the same block, and in this case, even under the same roof. But I think we in the arts world do that too. And let me explain. As I said before, I live in New York, but specifically, I live in Queens. And Queens is arguably the most diverse place on the planet, with 138 languages spoken. In fact, there are more speakers of Bukhari in Queens than in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. And if you've been to New York, you have more than likely been to Queens because both New York's airports are there, LaGuardia and JFK. But most people just hop into a cab and race to Manhattan. They miss the opportunity to see culture at the epicenter of New York's demographic change. So for example, this is a Russian Orthodox church in a street in Flushing, Queens in 1970. This is the same street today. This is the Ganesha Hindu temple. It is the largest Hindu temple in all of North America. And over 40 years, through a creative placemaking that has transformed the neighborhood, this festival, in fact, brings 10,000 people to that small neighborhood. They've created an urban cultural campus that includes a senior center, a low-cost popular restaurant, and it has the only large theater in that heavily populated area. And this theater is for use by all people. But they are completely off the radar of the arts because they don't use a 501c3 nonprofit model, and they don't use art sector terms. So for example, they have Shilpi. These are highly skilled artists from India who come to do the sculptures and the carving in the temple. And they reside for long periods of time on campus. Now, in the nonprofit arts world, we would call that an international artist in residency program. But more impressive than that, the temple has been sustained for over 40 years by now 22,000 members, which is an impressive number for any nonprofit trying to build an annual donor program. Let me show you another example on the other end of the country. Over an enormous geography, from Alaska to British Columbia to the state of Washington, First Nations people have revived the canoeing traditions that connect them. This epic, week-long canoe journey involves now over 1,000 paddlers, most of them young people, and is attended by upwards of 15,000 people at the communities that receive them. Over the year, youth advance the arts of canoe carving, dance, regalia making. They participate in language preservation, nation-to-nation protocols, ecological science, navigation. Tina Kukan, the head of the Longhouse in Olympia, Washington, says that the canoe journeys have reversed a brutal history of miseducation and forced assimilation of native peoples. And like the Hindu temple, it has been self-sustaining. It is based in a barter and gift economy and a culture of generosity for the communal good. My point, I'm wondering if we can learn from public space that is already activated by the arts, that is functioning in a kind of parallel universe, but that, in my opinion, offers some of the most vivid examples of a potential collective creative future. I'm wondering how we might have to reshape ourselves in order to engage with that change. I wonder, for example, how this change will reshape our own values and our identities. Can we learn to operate from a culture of a shared good? Can we learn to change the narrative of scarcity and of resource competition? This is a challenging time for the arts community. We are in a world that is changing, but it's also a chance for us to connect in ways that we haven't yet done, if we can only activate ourselves. Thank you.
I'm curious, you work for the Ford Foundation, you're a funder.
Yes, I am. Guilty.
I'm curious about these last projects that you were showing. How do they work in terms of funding? Are they in the same system, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's the very reason why I brought them out as examples, because you know, I can fund Creative Time. We do fund Creative Time, the New Museum, Prospect, New Orleans. Many of the projects that have been mentioned today, we are able to fund them because they function within our system. And I'm really concerned by looking at really large and projects of scale. These are not like, oh, we must help these people. These are communities that are doing, you know, whether it's the hip-hop community, you know, we've seen that, graffiti community, but I wanted to bring in the indigenous community and immigrant community that are working in ways that I think are already at scale and that have much to teach us because they have really been sustained by their communities and the way people live. And I think that sometimes we in the art world, we're kind of trained to not see beyond certain categories. We don't validate unless there's an outside intervention. And, you know, so it's as if the space is activated, but we're not activated. So we need to retrain ourselves. But also figure out what the appropriate way would be to give support, because it's not always handing someone money. It might be certain kinds of resources, in this case, around supporting the youth training, perhaps. I mean, really asking what would be the appropriate way to enter into a situation.
So you'd suggest that you would maybe need a different kind of structure for these kinds of activities?
I'm not suggesting that we need a separate structure for these kinds of activities versus art activity. This, I believe it's one arts ecology, and I believe that the existing arts ecology has much to learn from this arts ecology. And so what are those lessons and how can we enact them?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.